Good evening, church. I'm excited to get to preach tonight. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 23. This time, we're just looking at one verse, 23:13. It'll be a fun adventure. It'll either be 15 minutes or like 2 or 3 hours. So we're going to dive straight in. Just kidding, it won't be that long. Exodus chapter 23, verse 13. So this weekend, I had a really great time. I actually got to go to a wedding for a family friend. I was in Shenandoah National Park, perfect time of year for it. Got to see the pretty leaves, and I got to see a deer, which was great because it didn't hit my car, and I didn't hit it with mine. But we looked at each other as I drove down the road. And one of the best parts about this wedding was that my whole family was there. I'm one of 5 kids, so I've got a lot of brothers and sisters, and we were all there. We got to hang out, eat meals together, and one of these days actually coincided with my late grandfather's birthday. And so we had this photo they were passing around of my grandfather, and they were talking about who looked more like him, me or my brother. A couple people said my brother, most people said me. I just said he was a very handsome man, so I don't know who's right, but I know I am. But no one was surprised that I looked like my grandfather. No one was surprised that my brother looks like my grandfather. When I was a kid growing up, I would look at pictures of my dad when he was my age, and people would assume, and I would assume that it was a picture of me because we looked so similar when we were little kids. And no one is surprised by that because you're supposed to look like your parents, right? That's normal, that's expected. Well, the same is true of God's children, right? As the people of God, we're supposed to look like God. I'm not saying a flowy white beard or a glowing halo. I'm saying that the way that we live our lives should reflect the character of God. Does that make sense? That we as God's people, as his children, should imitate him. People should be able to tell based off of how we live our lives that we are affiliated with him, that we are like him. God actually makes this explicit in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 45. He says to be holy as I am holy. Very simple, very complex, very easy to understand, very hard to live out. Be holy as God is holy. That is what we as his people are called to do. Our identity should reflect the holiness of God. That's actually the main point of tonight's message, that we should reflect the holiness of God in our lives and in our worship. See, in this section of Exodus, God has been teaching his people how to live like his people. They are his. He chose them from all the nations of the earth. He rescued them. And now he's telling them, this is how my people are supposed to behave. Those who bear my name, this is what they're supposed to act like. He's calling them to live in line with their identity. So like I said, it's just one verse tonight, so let me pray, and then we'll jump in and see what this one verse has in store. Please join me in prayer. Dear Lord, I am so thankful for the richness of your word, that we can see you clearly through the things you have called us to do. Lord, I thank you for your call, even when it feels impossible to keep, because you are gracious to forgive where we fall short and gracious to free us to walk in obedience. For all these things in your son's name, amen. So the first thing we're going to look at in this verse is this idea of watchful obedience. Let me read it so you can see what I mean. This is Exodus chapter 23, verse 13. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. Very simple command, 2 parts. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, to the commands of the Lord, and do not mention the names of other gods. This first thing we see is this command to watchful obedience, that he calls them to carefully keep all of the commandments that he has given them. That Hebrew word there translated as pay attention is sometimes translated as to keep or to observe or to watch. This idea that God has given you instructions, do them, right? He's told you what to do, now do it. Not just be casual about it. Don't just view it as a good idea, but rather be careful. Pay attention to make sure that you do everything that God has called you to do. I think the difference between kind of a casual following and like this kind of strict obedience can be seen in the difference between cooking and baking. I don't know if you guys are good cooks. I am not a good cook, and I'm even worse at baking. It's very sad because I have to eat what I cook. But when you're cooking, right, when you're following a recipe that's like making chicken or something, you can kind of get a little loosey-goosey with the rules, right, with the instructions. You can sub in ingredients, you can make changes. You try that with something that you're baking, right? You try to switch out salt for sugar, right? It's going to be a disaster. It's this careful, I have to follow every step of the rules. See, God called them to carefully keep all of his commandments, not just to think about them or remember them, but to actually obey them. He was serious about this. See, in Exodus 19, he introduces himself to them. He meets them at this mountain, and he shows himself with fire and thunder and a voice like the mountains, that shakes the mountains. Right? That is his first impression when he calls them to keep these commandments. That's the background to this call to obedience. I know in school growing up, whenever we had a new teacher and start of a new school year, he or she would be particularly strict those first couple of weeks. They made very clear that you had to keep every bit of their instructions because they wanted you to understand that they were the authority. Well, God's introduction to them was this Sinai scene with fire and thunder and a voice that shook the earth, and now he's calling them to pay attention to his commandments. And there's a bit of an implied warning in this instruction. Right? We've talked about before that a holy God is dangerous, that he is just, that he sets these boundaries and says, you'll go no further than this, you will do what I say. And when we transgress his rules, there is judgment. And the Israelites got a first-hand view of the judgment of God when he rescued them from Egypt. Right, that's how the story of Exodus begins. They're slaves in Egypt where the Egyptians are oppressing them, killing their children, and God brings plague after plague on the Egyptians to liberate his people. So they know good and well what can happen when you make yourself an enemy of God. And so he reminds them to keep to pay attention to all that he has said. Now, what is this all that he has said? Well, the past couple of weeks, we've been going through chapters 20 to 23, and we've seen all these different commandments that God has given. He started out with the 10 commandments in chapter 20, and then he gives commandments about worship, commandments about how we should treat each other, regulations for social affairs, all these different things. They really can kind of fall into two categories. He gives commandments about loving God, what that should look like, no idols, how his altar should be kept, keeping the Sabbath, these kind of laws that govern their relationship with God, that govern their worship. They reflected his holy character and how valuable he is. And then he also gave them these laws about loving people, right? Prohibitions against different types of slavery, the command not to murder, right? Not controversial, not to steal, not to commit adultery, protections for the poor, all of these different laws that governed how we treat each other. And these two reflected the character of God because they showed how he treated people, how he treats people. And so God gave them these laws, like I said before, to teach them how to live like his people. See, I think it's really important that as we talk about the laws of God, that we understand these laws did not earn them their salvation. I think that's just such a natural way that our minds go, that we think if we keep the rules that God has given us, that's how we're going to earn his love and favor. We're going to earn our salvation, our place in heaven by doing the things that God has said to do. But when we read this story, they were saved from Egypt before they were even given the law. He had already saved them, already took them to be his people before they did anything to earn it. Obedience doesn't earn salvation. Salvation actually precedes obedience. See, God wasn't impressed by their rule keeping. He saved them before he gave them the law, but then because he loved them, he gave them his law to show them how to be his people. It was a gift, it was a blessing. but it was also what was expected of people bearing his name. See, I think as we talk about doing things, keeping the laws of God, we should understand that there is a connection between who you are and how you behave. Right? There's this link between who you are and what you should do. Honestly, most religious systems, I think, have this connection backwards. They teach that you are something because of what you've done. Right? Like in Islam, if you keep the 5 pillars of Islam, you do your Hajj, you pray every day, you go on your pilgrimage, then you are a good Muslim. Your identity is based off of your accomplishments. Same thing with Buddhism. You have to walk the 8-fold path to be a Buddhist. But with Christianity, it's the other way around. You live differently because your identity has been transformed, right? You are something, and that influences how you behave. Identity precedes behavior. The Israelites were called to carefully keep God's laws because they were his people. And I think we understand this, right? We understand that certain identities come with expectations. Like we expect a king or a government ruler to be just and fair with his people. We expect a parent to be loving and nurturing. That identity brings a certain behavior to mind. And so God gives them this new way to behave based off their new identity, and that also was a part of their salvation. I think there's a deficit in the way in the church we often talk about God's salvation. Often we talk about it as this idea of sin and of guilt and forgiveness, right? That we are guilty because of our sin, and Jesus died carrying our sin, carrying our guilt, and so now we are no longer guilty, we're forgiven. And that is absolutely true. That is beautiful. That's the gospel that I will be preaching till I die. But I think that's only one part of the picture, this guilt-forgiveness dichotomy. I think that our salvation is also about freedom from bondage, freedom from sin. See, our problem is more than just guilt. It's the sin that is in our world and in our lives. Right? Like sin is not just something we need to stop doing. It's something we need to be saved from. It's destructive. It breaks relationships. It causes trauma and oppression, and ultimately it leads to death. And so God not only forgives us of our guilt when we come to him in faith, he frees us from our sins. He allows us to walk in a different way, to make different choices, to experience freedom from the bondage of sin. See, the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt. That's how this story of Exodus starts. They were unable to worship God as his people ought to do. In fact, in Exodus chapter 5, Moses goes before Pharaoh to ask, just let us go so we can worship God in the desert. And Pharaoh not only says no, he doubles their workload. He makes life more difficult for them. He refused to allow them to serve God. And so God freed them from Pharaoh so that they could serve him. He freed them from the fruitless work they were doing, making bricks without straw in Egypt, so that they could walk in obedience to him. He doesn't just save us from guilt, he saves us from sin. And he saves us for his service. And so as we see these commandments, this call to do everything that God has commanded us to do, we should look at it not just as an imposition or a checklist to check off, but actually as an invitation to a better type of life. Often I have heard, particularly from young men, this question that if God forgives me, then why can't I just sin all I want? Right? God's forgiveness never runs out, so why can't I just do what I want and then ask forgiveness afterwards? If he's already paid for my sin, I might as well get what he paid for, right? And when I hear that question, I think they don't understand what sin really is. I think that's what they're missing, that they don't truly understand that sin leads to death. That it's not this good thing God is keeping you from, it's a bad thing he wants to rescue you from. See, sin disrupts God's good plan for creation. It makes everything worse. And Jesus wants to save us from the sin that is destroying our lives. And so if you think that you should just sin and sin and sin because God has already forgiven you, I'm honestly worried about your salvation. I think you've missed the whole point of the gospel. That God wants you to be free from sin. See, God never runs out of grace. But if you don't see the brokenness of sin, how fruitless it is, how it leads to death, if you don't see the beauty of a life lived in Christ, walking in the power of his Spirit, then I'm worried you don't understand the gospel in the first place. See, we are called to keep his commandments as a gift, as an invitation to greater life. So we should be holy as he is holy. We should be careful in our keeping of his commandments. We should pursue holiness in our lives and our actions. We should avoid the things that God calls sin. We should seek to join in the work that he calls us to do. And this covers every single area of your life. It's not about what you do on Sunday mornings or youth group once a week. This is every area of your life. This covers dating. This covers relationships. This covers how you work, where you work, what you do with your money. Every area of your life should reflect the character of God. And I think one of the biggest challenges to living holy lives in the modern age is just how uncool it is to be holy, right? Like you're a square. I don't even know if that's a cool way to say uncool. I don't think it is. Outed myself. I'm a square. Right? Like it's just not cool. And I think we underestimate how pernicious of a pressure, how subtle of an influence something being uncool can be in terms of derailing our walk with the Lord. I grew up in a Christian school, and kind of paradoxically in this private Christian school, being holy was one of the uncoolest things that you could be, right? Pursuing God, saying no to sin clearly and loudly was one of the least cool things that you could be or do. Our culture just doesn't value the pursuit of holiness, of obeying God, especially when it's inconvenient. And so I don't want you to underestimate the power of peer pressure, because I think that for most believers, if someone walked up to them and said, deny Jesus, they would say no. But I think for many of us, if instead of that outright challenge to our faith, it was just a subtle pressure to compromise on the things he's called us to that we face day in and day out, we're going to start to make that compromise. Right? If our coworkers are less than honest about their timesheets when they punch in or punch out at work, we might feel tempted to follow that pattern. If we're in school and all our classmates are cheating to get the grade, we might feel like we could also cheat to get the grade. If everybody else is doing it, we might as well just follow the crowd. If you're in that relationship and you think that compromise in God's instructions will make this relationship better, we might just be tempted to compromise what God has called us to do, how he has called us to live. I think that the overt challenge is easy to say no to, but those subtle everyday pressures to pursue a sinful compromise rather than the holiness of God are the things that lead us down a path further and further from his will. So maybe we shouldn't watch that movie. Maybe we shouldn't go to that party or take that job because we're seeking to do everything that God has called us to do. Maybe we need to embrace the uncool of holy living, to live like God even when it brings ridicule or mockery from our neighbors. You know, tonight I ask you to consider, what is God calling you to say no to? Where is he calling you to make an uncomfortable step towards holiness? Or what is he calling you to do? What act of obedience do you need to begin to do what he has called you to do? So the first half of this command is this call to do everything that God has said, to have holy lives. And the second half, we'll see this call to holy worship. Let me read verse 13 again as we move to the second point. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. So this second half is focusing on idolatry. Make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. Like I said earlier, this weekend I was at a wedding, and this kind of unstated rule of weddings came up in a conversation with my brother. you do not mention anybody's ex at a wedding. Right? Like you don't bring up the ex-girlfriend, even if it's a really funny story, you don't do it. You don't mention the ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend at the wedding. And it's this kind of absolute denial, like don't even mention their name, that God is calling for in his people. These other idols, these false gods that they worshiped, weren't even to be mentioned. Nobody was supposed to hear it on their lips. An absolute prohibition against the worship of other gods. You can't even get to worship, don't even talk about them. Make no mention of false gods. And it's interesting, God has just reminded them to do all of the things he commanded, but he emphasized specifically this command against idolatry. Because he's already commanded them not to worship other gods. Actually, the very first of the 10 commandments, Exodus 20, verses 1-3, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. That was the first thing on his list. No other gods, no worshiping these false idols. And yet he felt the need to reiterate this here in this passage. Do everything I said, especially do not worship these other gods. And I think part of the reason for that is that the defining characteristic of the people of God is that they worship God. That seems kind of simple, right? Like the thing that makes them the people of God is that they worship God. Like the defining characteristic of a husband is that he has a wife, right? The defining characteristic of a parent is that they have children. Like it's just in the name, it's in the definition. The people of God should worship God. They should not worship other gods. God's people are defined by their relationship to him. And it doesn't matter how well they keep his rules if they're not worshiping him. It doesn't matter how closely they follow the pattern he sets out in these commands if they are worshiping other gods. See, all of their neighbors were idol worshipers. All of the people in that region of the world were polytheistic, worshiping many different gods. That was what was normal, but God calls them to an exclusive relationship where they worship only him. In fact, one of the metaphors that runs throughout the Old Testament for idol worship is spiritual adultery. This idea of an unfaithful spouse cheating on her husband who has provided her with everything. God has always painted as the faithful husband who has lavishly provided for his wife, but Israel and the Israelites are painted as the unfaithful spouse who turn to other gods and bring destruction into their lives. And so here God commands them, he reminds them to be holy in their worship, not to mix the worship of God with the worship of idols. One of my favorite lines, speaking of weddings, one of my favorite lines in traditional wedding vows is this idea of forsaking all others, of turning away from everyone else. See, I don't think anyone would accept a wedding vow if the husband promised that he would be faithful, but not on the weekend, right? If he said, oh, you got me Monday through Friday, but Saturday and Sunday is my time, I don't promise to be faithful. I won't forsake others on those days. I think we would all say, hey, maybe don't marry that guy. I think we'd all say, hey, maybe run and find somebody better. God's expectation for his people was that they would forsake all other gods, that there would be no idols in their midst, that he would be the one they worshiped. He demanded their worship. And I think we can consider idolatry as kind of this thing of the past and not realize how present it is today. But I think it's because we have a too maybe narrow definition of idolatry. One definition of idolatry from this great book called Counterfeit Gods by Tim Keller is that it's the things that we love, trust, and obey more than God. Let me say that again. Idolatry is the things that we love, trust, and obey more than God. It's what we trust for security and for prosperity, for getting that future that we hope for getting those things that we think that we need. Right? The gods of Egypt, or the people of Egypt, had different gods that controlled the different areas of their world. They had a god of the Nile. They had a god of the sun, a god of fertility, a god of death, and they worshiped these things that they worried about, these things that were powerful in their lives. Because idols give us the illusion of control over the chaos of our lives. Right? They would sacrifice to the god of the Nile so that it would flood, or it wouldn't flood depending on the season, so that they'd be able to grow crops. They would sacrifice to the god of fertility so that their crops and animals would be bountiful. They were trying to control the things they were worried about. They were looking to these false gods for security and prosperity. They were trusting them and not trusting the God who truly is in control. And idolatry is still a problem in our world. We live in a very multicultural world, and many of our neighbors practice the explicit worship of idols. The largest Hindu temple in America just opened up in Jersey. That was like a month ago that this happened. All this past Halloween season, I read multiple articles in the Philadelphia Inquirer about witchcraft, celebrating and promoting witchcraft, like people who are worshiping and communing with spirits. This isn't an ancient problem or a far away problem. Idolatry is actively practiced in our city, in our communities. People are worshiping these figures of stone and wood that cannot save them. Our neighbors are turning to false gods for hope and security. So we need to take this commandment seriously. We need to be careful not to give any credence or credibility to these idols in our community. So we need to be on guard for that explicit idolatry, but there is a subtler kind of idolatry that I think can be just as damaging. There's this idolatry of the heart. See, an idol is anything that we love and trust and obey more than Jesus. So that doesn't have to be an explicit idol. It doesn't have to be a golden statue with glowing red eyes. It can be anything that we love more than God. We can make an idol out of the good things that God has given us in our lives. A relationship could be an idol. Your finances could be an idol. Your future, your education, your children, your family could be an idol. For example, money is an idol. If you love and trust in money more than God, it is an idol. If you're willing to break the commandments that God has given so that you can get more money, that is an idol. A relationship can be an idol. If you place your joy and your hope for the future in a relationship more than in your relationship with God, it is an idol. If you're willing to break the commandments of God when it comes to sexual morality for a relationship, that is an idol. And idolatry and sin are connected, right? These two halves of these two commandments that God has given us are linked, right? He says, do everything that I have commanded and do not worship, because when you worship idols, it leads to sin. Idolatry is at the root of a lot of other sins. But I think that we can kind of understand that keeping the commandments of God correctly flows from worship of him, from holy worship, right? When we properly understand who God is, when we revere him, obedience is the natural response. The clearer we see his character, the more easily we can imitate him. So worship leads to obedience, and likewise, idolatrous worship will lead to disobedience. When something becomes more important than God, we will break his commandments in order to get that thing that has become more important. And so the idols we trust in can shape the struggles that we have with sin. I know in my life, one of my big idols, recurring problems for me is it's often called fear of man or people pleasing. I really like it when people like me. I know that's a crazy thing. Not a lot of people feel that way, but I really like it when people like me. And so it's so tempting to change my behavior in ways that disappoint God, that go against his commandments, so that I can maintain the approval of people. It's so tempting for me to maybe soften my conversation about the gospel or avoid this hard thing that I feel like God is calling me to do because I want people to like me. That idol leads me away from obedience to the commandments of God. And we see the same thing being true in the history of God's people. In the Old Testament, one of the most horrendous examples of sin in the Israelites came from their worship of a false god. In the period of the kings, they began to worship Molech, the god of the Moabites. And part of these barbaric rituals was the sacrifice of children. They would sacrifice their own children to this god. They began to worship a false god, and it led them into sin. We see the same thing in the New Testament when Jesus flips tables in the temple. He walked into the temple where it was supposed to be a house of prayer for the nations and finds that the court where the Gentiles, where the non-Jewish people could go, had been turned into a money changer's stall. It was all about making money and making money off these people who came to worship God. And so he flips the tables. He chases them out of town with a bullwhip. It's crazy. See, they loved money more than the mission of God and turned his temple into a den of thieves. When you have idols, something that you love more than God, that you are trusting in, hoping in more than God, it will lead you into sinful behavior. So we need to flee from idolatry. We can't play around with something this dangerous. We need to be clear to reject any affiliation with idols. We can't let our neighbors think that they can find life in idolatry. Right? We talked when we were going through 1 Corinthians about this idea of eating meat sacrificed to idols. And really the crux of that argument that Paul was making was that you should not do anything that causes a member of your church or a member of your community to worship these idols. We should not do anything if we encourage idol worship. I think where this kind of hits the road is ideas like astrology. Like astrology is kind of in right now where people want to talk about their star sign, or maybe it's kind of crystals and new age ideas like saging your house to get rid of the demons. I think we need to be very careful with those types of things because they can give credence to a worldview that props up and supports idolatry, idol worship. So we need to be careful not to approve of the idol worship in our community, but we also need to be careful to constantly be repenting of the idolatry in our own hearts, of the things that are good gifts from God that we allow to take his place in our hearts. We need to watch ourselves carefully to make sure that the blessings he's given us don't replace him in our lives. We need to repent of the subtle idolatry that infiltrates our hearts and trust only in Jesus. So these are these two commandments that we get. And I think that hearing them both, it can be easy anytime we hear these commands of God to feel discouraged by our inability to keep those commandments. It can feel impossible. It can feel like it is not a burden we can lift. So that's why this last point I want to talk about are the limits of the law. See, I don't think that the commandment that he gave them was sufficient to make them perfectly keep it, right? The law was not enough to make them obey it. Like, for example, we just had Halloween. Did anybody put out a bowl of candy with a just take one sign? I don't know if you guys have ever seen those just take one signs when you're trick-or-treating. They don't do anything. Like, yes, the sign tells you what the right choice is, but it does not stop you from taking more than one piece of candy. It doesn't stop you from dumping that bowl into your bag and going on to the next house. Same thing with a keep out sign. A keep out sign without a fence attached to it does not actually stop you from going into those places. Laws like this can show you the right choice, but it cannot change your heart. It can tell you what you should do, but it can't actually change you. An example I've used in the past is this idea of an MRI machine. An MRI machine is this complex, powerful bit of technology that can tell you exactly what is wrong with you, but it can't do a thing to fix you. So God has given these instructions to do everything he has commanded, to have no hint of idolatry, and yet the Israelites messed it up. If you keep reading the story, Moses hasn't even come back down from the mountain, and they're building a golden calf and worshiping idolatrously. They had every reason to follow God's laws. They had his very commandments. They had his glory displayed in fire and thunder. They had seen his miracles as they were rescued from Egypt, and yet they couldn't keep his laws. They worship the golden calf. They grumble. They rebel. They trust in false gods. This is why in Galatians chapter 3, Paul talks about how the law can't give life. He's not a hater. He doesn't dislike God's law, but he recognizes its limitations. It cannot give life. Because I don't think the problem is the Israelites. I don't think that we would have done better in their position. I think the problem is people. I think it's that our hearts are naturally inclined to sin. We are broken. We love the wrong things. We choose the wrong things. We're destined to face the wrath of God. We cannot satisfy the requirements of a holy God. We cannot pay attention to all that he has said. We cannot remove every hint of idolatry from our midst. We cannot be good enough to earn his love or his approval. And we're trapped in a cycle of sin and brokenness where we continue to hurt ourselves and others. And just telling us to do better won't fix it. Thank God that's not the end of his message. Thank God that he didn't stop the book after Exodus chapter 23. You see, Jesus fulfills this law. Jesus is perfect. He kept all of the commandments. Where we fall short, he did not fall short. He was unmixed in his affection for God. He loved the Lord with all his heart, all his soul, and all his strength. And he rescues us from guilt and punishment. Right? We owe this debt of sin and death to God, yet Jesus paid the price for our sin on the cross. In our place, he died on the cross so that when we place our faith in him, we can be forgiven. We can share in his death, and even more, we can share in his resurrection. He was raised from the dead to new life so that we might have life with him. Jesus frees us from the bondage to sin. See, the power of Christ's resurrected life enables us to follow him in obedience. It enables us to do the things he's called us to do. When you place your faith in Jesus, when you repent of your sin and trust in him, his Spirit gives you the power to keep the commandments of God. He transforms your desires. He gives you a new heart. He renews your will so that you can choose the right things. He brings you into a community with people who will hold you accountable, who can help you walk in holiness and obedience. We cannot be holy like God without the salvation that comes through faith in Jesus Christ. But once we have placed our faith in him, we can begin to walk in holiness and obedience. If you are trying to please God without faith in his Son and the life that he provides, you are wasting your time. But if you have experienced the grace and forgiveness of Jesus, if you have been raised to new life with him, not only do you no longer have to labor to please God, you will be given the power to walk in obedience. And I'm not going to pretend like it's going to be easy. Like sin's going to suddenly no longer be alluring, but it is something that you can grow in. You can actively become more and more like him. If we trust him, he will empower us to walk in obedience to what he has called us. So what's the point? What do I want you to take away from this message? I want you to be holy like God is holy. To live a life that reflects the character of God. We should flee from sin. We should love our neighbors as we love ourselves. We should keep each command he has given us and say no to the things he has prohibited. I want you to worship God in holiness, to not put something else before him in your heart, to not play around with idolatry. But ultimately, you can't do those things without trust in Jesus. I want you to place your trust in Jesus to turn from your sins, place your faith in Jesus Christ, and walk in the new life that he gives you.